Welcome to another episode of Facts as we discover different aspects of the New Testament and Old Testament. Today, we're going to be looking at probably one of the more controversial issues as it relates to the New Testament. There are two main passages, if you've watched this show for any length of time or any activity I've done in debate or discussion or roundtable discussions, is that the two main issues that people have in the longer version of Mark and the woman caught in adultery, John 7:53 through 8:11, and then Mark 16:9 through 20. And the one that we're talking about today is probably the most interesting one for me, because over the years, I've accepted the long ending, and then there's been phases where I've kind of stiff-armed it. But if you've noticed, or for at any length of time you've been around me, you perhaps have noticed that I haven't done any discussion on this text particularly. And I think the reason for that is because I have had a hard time accepting or rejecting the passage as a whole. And recently I reached out to James Snapp, who has written extensively on this subject, because I'm actually intrigued by his argument more than most that I've heard on the TR end or maybe a King James only end. And some of the reasoning behind it is legit. And those of you that follow Facts or you've been a part of Explain International, you know we have guys in our team like Jonathan Sheffield who accepts the long ending. We have other guys who question it. We have other guys who aren't sure what they believe. So one of the things I want to do is bring a fair and balanced perspective. And one of the things I've always told our audience is think outside of the box, listen to all arguments, hear every argument, listen to every single detail, make sure you've studied it to its ultimate end, make a decision, have a conviction about it, move forward. The problem is when it comes to the long ending of Mark, there's really not much in evidence that stands against it. It's early evidence, but is it the only evidence? And I think one of the best people I could bring on to demonstrate the big picture evidence, detail and all, is James Snapp. So James Snapp's on today as my guest. And James, why don't you give a quick shout out and hello to everybody and jump into your notes and share it with our audience and let them see some of the research you have on Mark 16:9 through 20. And we'll take some questions from the audience at the end, and I'll ask my own questions before we get to them. So James, thanks for joining us on Facts, sharing this study on Mark 16.
Thank you, Stephen, and welcome everybody else. I have a very simple hypothesis about Mark 16:9 through 20, and I have prepared some slides here. I propose that Mark was interrupted as he wrote Mark 16 verse 8, and that interruption was permanent. In the 60s, in the first century, that was a time of great upheaval in Rome. And I believe that his colleagues in Rome, recognizing that what he had left was unfinished, added verses 9 through 20 from another composition by Mark, possibly something that was intended to be read in Rome at Easter. And only after this was done did copies begin to be made and distributed for church use. By the ordinary definition of what makes the original text, that makes Mark 16:9 through 20 original. Early scribes in Egypt, I believe, deleted verses 9 through 20 due to a meticulous desire to only include the main work that they regarded as having Peter's authority. In the first century and second century, the Gospel of Mark was considered the memoirs of Peter. Mark doesn't include the genealogies simply because that question hadn't come up, and by the time it was coming up, they were already in Rome and didn't have any access to any sources that would contain that. But regarding Mark 16:9 through 20, even though stylistically it doesn't look like something that is something that naturally follows Mark 16 verse 8. But I think that the people in Rome said, we're not going to make something up. We're going to continue the tradition that's been handed down to us. And that's what we have in verses 9 through 20. And that makes it part of the original text. The question is not...
Let me interrupt you at a couple places, James, so that way we can do some explanation here too. I probably should establish that from the beginning. So on this first slide, you're insinuating that there was a secondary inclusion that was not a part of maybe the first draft?
Well, I propose that Mark, as Peter's amanuensis, his secretary, he's all the time he's accompanying Peter. His collection of notes for Peter is gradually getting longer and longer. And by the time he sits down to write the Gospel of Mark, he has a definitive set of stories that he wants to tell.
Okay. And then, so particularly what they were doing in Egypt wasn't an evil attempt of deletion as much as trying to maintain the authoritative side of Peter's apostolic position behind it.
Well, I think the scribes in Egypt simply had a tradition that said, we're only going to keep the text that we have that we consider to be authoritative. They didn't consider verses 9 through 20 to be authoritative because they thought, well, this isn't really Petrine. We know it's from Mark, but we don't know if Peter ever put his seal of approval on these verses. And therefore, they either obliged it in one step, or they simply removed it all at once.
That's an interesting perspective, one that you don't hear much, and kind of from a lot of people in my audience who came from, a TR only, King James only view. The statement has always been made about the last 12 verses is that the people in Egypt were evil and using an evil agenda to get rid of them. Rather, you're suggesting it wasn't so much an evil agenda as much as they recognized, there was a Markan perspective that was added at the end. And they were trying to maintain that, I guess you could say, more Petrine authority than adding a secondary tradition into it, which would have been, they would have recognized from Mark, but it wasn't necessarily some evil scheme where they came together in Egypt and said, let's get rid of these verses, as some have suggested.
Yes, I think the scribes in the first century, or the second century, in Egypt were very, very meticulous. And that can be a good thing, or that can be a bad thing. You can want to only include what is in your exemplar, but also, what if somebody's written something else in the exemplar that looks like it was not from the main source? But that'll become clear, I think, as we go through the slides.
Sure, go ahead.
First of all, it's important to clear up a lot of the misinformation that's floating around out there. Here are some commentators, or some things in some commentators' books that you can see these claims. Norman Geisler claims that verses 9 through 20 are lacking in many of well, actually, I can't see all of the slides, so I'm sorry. In many of the most oldest and most reliable manuscripts, Larry O. Richards says in many ancient Greek manuscripts, the gospel ends at 68. Wilfred J. Harrington again says that the passage is omitted in very many Greek manuscripts of the gospel. Don Jewell says, according to the almost unanimous testimony of the oldest Greek manuscripts, Mark ends at 68. So if you read the commentaries, for instance, in the Message, and by the way, the Message has been updated and improved since Eugene Peterson's first edition. But in the first edition of the Message, he said that Mark 16, 9 to 20 is contained only in later manuscripts. So if you've been misinformed by these writers, and these are just samples, there's many others, but if you've been this misinformed, then you would naturally say, well, it's only in the late manuscripts. Of course, you would conclude that Mark 69 to 20 is not original. The thing is, every single one of these commentators is wrong. Here, I'd like to present something you don't usually see this. This is from one of the writings of T.C. Skeet. Tischendorf had said that in Codex Sinaiticus, at the end of John, that the last verse had been erased. And finally, they got around to putting it under ultraviolet light. And sure enough, as you see here, this is a page of Sinaiticus, a detail of a page. And you can see that the scribe initially left out the last verse. and he wrote in the closing title. But at some later point, he erased that closing title and that closing arabesque or coronus design and put it back in. And so here you can see what is erased, and also you can see what is included at the end. So scribes were capable of editing the text as they transcribed it. And we see this especially in the Alexandrian, one of the more famous Alexandrian manuscripts, Codex Sinaiticus. Now this is Codex Vaticanus. What you see here on the left side is the manuscript as it exists, but on the right side, because some people will say, well, there's this blank space in Codex B, Codex Vaticanus, and that's unusual, but it's not big enough to hold verses 9 to 20. Well, I cut and pasted individual letters one by one, slightly compressing them, and as you can see, verses 9 to 20 actually do fit the space. So when you're asking, what is this big blank space here in Vaticanus for? Because it's the only blank column in all of the New Testament in Codex B. Well, it's pretty clear it's memorial space left for verses 9 to 20. And memorial space didn't have to be exact. It was enough to just leave a space so it was obvious that the scribe had recollected something that should be there.
So do you think that the scribe behind Codex B, because he did conclude in that left in the original document itself, he concluded Carta Marcon there, or whatever he placed at the end. It's kind of blurry on the screen, but he did conclude it there. But he would have clearly had knowledge of the longer ending, but would have for the purpose that, so this scribe would have done exactly what you said in slide 1. In Egypt, he would have recognized, all right, the Petrine authority aspect. So knowing that, he went ahead and concluded it in verse 8. Do you wonder why he didn't perhaps leave a footnote or something for his knowledge of the longer ending? What would be your thoughts on why the scribe didn't leave some sort of footnote?
Well, I think that the scribe of Vaticanus wasn't making the manuscript for himself. He was making it for a sponsor somewhere. And so he left the passage blank because he wanted to preserve his exemplar. But also, he wanted to make it possible if his sponsor would decide, wait a minute, I want to include those verses, then with it formatted the way it was, or the way it is on your screen, it would be possible to include the verses if the sponsor so desired. So you're saying,
so you're saying he intentionally left the format in the manner he did, which you duplicated all the letters that would be required, which is pretty incredible. And he would have done that for the purpose of somebody else wanting to, because this would have been a publicly read manuscript, more than likely, just the way that it's set up. So he would allow that to be included for anybody that would receive that copy of it to include.
Well, the scribe made the decision not to make a decision. He left that decision up to the eventual owner of the manuscript.
And I think that's probably why there's so many rumors about Codex B. Like, okay, is that one of the ones that, Constantine, had Eusebius publish all these Bibles and so forth? It may not have been that, but it would have been something similar. It may have been something of a similar format. It was meant to be sent to churches for public reading. It's definitely it's written in such a majestic way. I mean, the design of it is intelligent. Somebody knew what they were doing. They were a well-written scribe. It was clearly used for church readings. So that's interesting, James. I've actually never heard that side of the argument before. Usually, again, you got to understand, most of my audience is TR, King James only background. We were taught that scribe had an evil intent to remove it. Not that he was following protocol or even leaving the possibility of a church to include later. It was, I hate these verses, I'm taking them out. That was the instruction that we were taught. So this is a fresh perspective that my audience probably isn't familiar with.
I don't think the scribe of Codex B was being malicious in the least. he was simply copying out his exemplar. The removal of verses 9 through 20 had taken place generations before the Codex Vaticanus was made.
Fascinating. All right, I'll let you continue. Sorry, I wanted to pause there because that was fascinating. Thank you.
But the thing to see is that in the Old Testament of Codex B, there's also blank spaces, and Dan Wallace says it's hard to figure out why these blank spaces are there, but really it's super easy. One space is there because that's where two scribes' work came together. This is the work of one scribe, and this is the work of the next scribe. And that's simply where the two parts of the book. That's where they meet up. The next one is at the beginning of the books of poetry, where you have a change in format. Most pages of Codex Vaticanus are 3 columns per line, but in the books of poetry, it's 2 columns. And so there's a necessary change there. And then the third place is at the end of the Old Testament, at the end of Daniel and Bel and the Dragon. That's where Bel and the Dragon is the end of the Old Testament in Codex Vaticanus. And Matthew comes next. And of course, Matthew would begin a fresh choir. So there's no mystery about why those blank spaces are there. There simply seems that were almost inevitable during the production of the manuscript. This blank column in B is different. It's there deliberately. There's nothing in the production of the manuscript that would cause this to appear. It's there by intent. Let's proceed. And by the way, the closing titles were not necessarily added by the main scribe. If you go through Vaticanus and look at the titloi at the top of the pages, that's the same hand that's adding the closing titles, or a hand very much like it.
Yeah.
Okay. Now let's consider Codex Sinaiticus. It also has a very unusual formatting at the end of Mark. And I think the reason for this is because it is a replacement page. In fact, there's no question that it is a replacement page, but not everybody is familiar with how distinctive the characteristics are. You can see that the scribe usually wrote about 635 to 650 letters per column. And that's what you see in this choir, or this folio, rather. But on the pages where Mark 16:2 begins, that drops. Then when Luke begins, it skyrockets to 618. And if you look down here, you can see black and white replicas of these pages. On the page where Mark ends, it ends at 16:8. That's the main page here. But the previous column only has 552 letters. And people ask, well, you ask if you notice it. You would ask, why so few letters? Why does the scribe who usually writes 630 or 635 letters per column, why in this column did he only write 552? And part of that reason is because this is a cancel sheet. Are you familiar with the codicology of cancel sheet?
Yes, sir. But let me back up there. How frequently does that happen at the end of other books in this manuscript? So you have the cancel sheet. Does that take place in other books of the New or Old Testament that Sinaiticus contains? Or is this like unique?
I think there are six other pages are sheets.
Folios.
Sheets in folios where this occurs.
So it's not necessarily unique just to Mark, but it's out of pattern more than anything, based on the writing of columns in the folios per sheet, because that's a big drop off.
Well, in this particular case, I think you have something happening that is unique, or that is unique. But the thing to see is that when the main scribe, as he's writing the beginning of Luke, he makes a mistake and leaves out some material, like a whole paragraph of about 300 letters.
Hmm.
That means the proofreader, when he sees that and says, hey, you left something out that's really big here, I can't just fix this with a little note in margin. We're going to have to redo this whole sheet. And so he undertakes to redo the whole sheet. That's what we see. That's what all that we actually have is what the proofreader wrote, not the main scribe wrote. But as the proofreader is redoing the page, he starts in Luke in this column. Let's 4, 8, 9, 10, in column 11. He starts writing Luke there because he knows his challenge is not going to be writing out the text of the last part of Mark. The challenge is going to be fitting all the material in Luke, because the main scribe left out a piece of it, and now he's going to have to write the same text plus the part that was left out, and make it all fit so the last line that he's writing will correspond with the next line on the main scribe's work.
So that goes back to where I was pretty sure that's where you were going. So the point that you're making about Sinaiticus is that it was more about Luke than Mark. The issue was more about Luke 1 than it was Mark 16 here.
I'm saying that's what occasioned the creation of a cancel sheet. Yes.
And you're saying that happened on a couple of occasions. You're saying that happened on a couple of occasions in Sinaiticus and other places as well.
Yes. I forget exactly how many, but I could look it up sometime.
I'm curious about that too, because so would there be an indicator that they were the cancel sheet would have been distinct from the previous and the next page? What makes it distinct that we can look at it? Because I know we all know that have examined Sinaiticus, there wasn't just one scribe. There was a corrector and a corrector. So you're saying that the second hand is the one that would have come in and did this section, and we don't have what was probably. So you're saying this is more of the work of the second hand, basically, at the end of the day.
Yes, these 4 pages at the end of Mark, from Mark 14:54 to the end to the last page, are all the work of the diathotes, the proofreader.
Mm-hmm.
That's whose handwriting we see on these 4 pages. We don't see the text written by the main scribe because he made a bad mistake at writing Luke, and those pages were thrown out. What we see here is the diathotes writing, and that's whose hand we see here. Now,
so do you think it's possible? So do you think it's possible that the second hand the first hand, the original writer or scribe would have had the long ending, or would he have followed what the guy in Vaticanus did, since it was around the same time frame? Would they have knowledge of it and also have sent it with the possibility of fill-in? Which one would you think would have been more likely on this manuscript, that he would have had it, or did what the scribe at Vaticanus did?
Just gauging probabilities. I mean, you're asking for a guess, but my guess would be the main scribe also left out.
So he'd have done what Vaticanus did because of the Alexandrian influence in that Egyptian area.
I don't know if he would have done what the scribe of Vaticanus did, but he would have not had any more text of Mark beyond verse 8.
That made sense. Okay. Yeah, that would have made sense because of the region. They would have been trying to maintain that Petrine authority again.
But one of the things to see here, I don't want to go on this too long, but I don't want to overlook this point either, is that as the diathotes is recreating these pages in Mark, he writes at it for first 3 columns his normal rate, but then he jumps up to 707. If he had kept on at the rate of 707 per column, he could easily have fit verses 9 through 20 on these pages. But he didn't. Going on, he drops down to a little bit less than the normal rate. As he begins Mark 16, verse 2, in column 8, as he begins Mark 16, verse 1, he accidentally skips part of the verse. And when he gets to his 9th column, and remember, in this hypothesis, he's already written these last 6 columns. He's already written the text of Luke. He's working on Mark now.
Right.
So when he writes Mark 16, verse 2, he realizes, wait a second, I don't have enough text here. If I write at my normal rate, I will finish this column, column 9, and leave a blank column right here all the way through before the text of Luke. But he does not want to leave a blank column. And that's why, instead of writing at a rate of 635, he stretches out his lettering. He does not compress the nomina sacra for Jesus in Mark 16, verse 6. But he stretches everything out really far. So he has 37 letters left over so as to not leave a blank column. And
so that's an interesting perspective too. So he elongated the nomina sacra instead of actually utilizing it, which the scribe all through has utilized the nomina sacra before and after the section. So he was doing everything he could to stretch the numbers in that section. That's an interesting perspective.
This copyist didn't want to do what we see in Vaticanus. He didn't want to leave what would look like or what would be capable of looking like that something was being left to include verses 9 through 20. In other words, this scribe has made a decision not only to not include it, but to make it so his work cannot be interpreted as a signal to make it includable.
Okay. And I got a Facebook message from somebody said, could you please explain the nomina sacra? So we'll go ahead and explain that real quick. So nomina sacra typically is this, it's that Latin for sacred name of God, which you see utilized in the Old Testament Hebrew, brought over into the Greek as well. So for example, the name God, simple enough in Greek, is theos. And instead of writing theos out because of reverence for the name, the holy name of God, it would just put theta and sigma without all the spelling out, and then put the line through on there to give it the indication of it's a sacred name. It sticks out in the page, but it also abbreviates it. You saw the same thing done with Yahweh, Jehovah, other sacred names in the Old Testament. So it's basically taking the full spelling of God, like theos, and just putting the first and last letter of theos in there with a line, giving that sacred name of honor.
In this case, it's the name Jesus, or in Greek, Jesus.
Okay.
So yes. It's usually abbreviated, but in this particular instance, I don't think the scribe does this elsewhere. But in this particular instance, because he's trying to use up as much space as possible, he writes out the name Jesus. Okay, let's continue.
Yep.
This is manuscript 304. Now, this is a medieval manuscript, and besides Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, it's the only other Greek manuscript in which the text of Mark stops at verse 8, which it does about line 7 down here, beside the little dot there. The rest of this is commentary. And then we have this little poem, but what you don't see is, usually when you have a Catena manuscript or a commentary manuscript, you would have something to say, thus ends the text of the comments on the Holy Gospel of Mark. Instead, you have just a little poem that says, as travelers rejoice on their homeland look, so also the scribe at the end of a book. But the commentary has been very similar to the commentary by a guy named Theophylact. And in Theophylact's full commentary, it includes comments on Mark 16, 9 through 20. And so there's some question of whether this is the complete text or whether this text itself in this manuscript was copied from a damaged exemplar. So 304 is from about the 1100s. Vaticanus and Sinaiticus are much earlier, from the 300s. Now let's go on, because we need to get some idea of the scale of the evidence. Now we all know that we all know the line manuscripts need to be weighed, not counted. But just to get an idea of the lay of the land, let's go ahead and count them. What manuscripts support Mark 16, 9 through 20? This is the beginning of a list. Codex A, C, D, E, G. You can go ahead and read them for yourself. That's uncials. And then there are the minuscules, the numbers without the zero before them. With the zero, it means uncial. Without the zero, it means minuscule. So here are some minuscules. And here are some more. And here are some more. And here are some more. For a total so far of 1,643 manuscripts. When we looked at Vaticanus and Sinaiticus and 304, that was it as far as the manuscripts that do not support Mark 16, 19, 20 in Greek.
All right, so let's pause Let's pause on that. So those that are watching, most uncials, because you got to remember what was said by commentators and others that, many late manuscripts don't contain, whereas most of the uncials would be the earlier manuscripts of the time. You're talking 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th century at times. And many of them do. Now, 2 of the earliest do not. Now, the unfortunate thing for Mark, and I know that James will probably lose this, we don't have but a fragment on the papyri side of Mark at this point that reaches an early stage, and it covers a very small section of chapter 1. But when you read commentaries, and this is what James is trying to point out as a correction, when you see commentaries that say many of the earliest manuscripts don't have this, it's not an accurate statement when many are 2. And then you have 1 that comes much later. It's a medieval manuscript, which he just showed you on the screen. Now, James, we're gonna have to pause for a second because we've got a couple of statements that came in that say, can we explain cancel sheet a little bit more? So cancel sheet real quick, since 3 or 4 of you have now said something about it. Cancel sheet is that the first scribe made a mistake that was big enough. He gave you the example in Luke chapter 1. He left out a very large section. It's not like in some of the manuscripts, like in John chapter number 5, you could put a little verse or a section or a phrase back into the margin instead of starting all over. Because remember, they're keeping patterns. James showed you patterns of words and sections and paragraphs. And so if a scribe misses a huge chunk, you don't just come into a margin and include a big chunk. You cancel the page. Go ahead, James.
A cancel sheet is simply another way of saying replacement pages.
Yeah. You put another page there and you correct it.
But because
the problem
it's easier to show than to tell. This is a sheet of paper, and you wouldn't just replace half the page, you would have to replace the whole page. Because the codices are being made out of sheets of parchment, to replace one page, you had to redo all 4 pages.
Correct.
And that is a cancel sheet. Okay?
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So it's easier to yes, cancel sheet's the way to go because you're saving time, space, money, resource, all of it. So it's a replacement page at the end of the day. So thank you for those questions. Go ahead, James. Sorry, we had a lot of people saying, can you please elaborate on that more? Go ahead.
Okay. Here we see Codex Alexandrinus. So the idea that Mark 16, 19, 20 is only in later manuscripts is completely absurd. You see it here in Codex A, right there. I show where the verse 9 is right there. This square in red, that's the same square in large in black. So obviously it's there in Codex A, which is from the early 400s. It's also in Codex C. Now, Codex C is what's called a palimpsest.
Yeah,
it's a recycled. Well, the copyist has recycled Codex C to replace its text with something else. The sermons from Ephraim hold on. Ephraim the Syrian. But if you very carefully erase the writing on the top, then you can see the writing on the bottom. And you can see here, that's what I've done. On the left is the writing that's been had new writing put on top of it. And on the right, I've taken out the new writing, and you can see the lower writing, or the original writing on the page. Underneath is Mark 16, verses 14 through 17. So Codex C has it, again, from the 400s. Codex D, which D.C. Parker has assigned to the early 400s, also has Mark 16, 6 through 15. Codex D is damaged in quite a few places, but generally there's no reason to suspect that it did not, when in its pristine form, have all 20 verses. So Codex C, Codex A, and so forth include verses 9 through, in their pristine form, had verses 9 through 20.
And it should be noted on Codex D, also known as Codex Bise, it was more of it was a very inaccurate manuscript, but it was clearly based on an early manuscript tradition. So probably earlier than Vaticanus Sinaiticus when you look at the tradition behind it. And it was more of a Western influence on that manuscript as well. But I found it interesting that Codex D has it just because of its tradition, which means going back to your earlier hypothesis, James, in slide 1, you have the West and Rome and areas like that, and their utilization of the last 12 verses compared to Egypt. There's almost evidence of that just looking between Codex D and looking at Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. You can almost see that influence because D has an early tradition behind it. It seems to be pretty early in its transmission, and possibly even a Latin influence. But with Codex D having it, you can see your hypothesis on slide 1 almost just looking at those 3 manuscripts alone. The Alexandrinus being earliest Byzantine, so that shows that in the East, going into the Byzantine Empire, showing that in Mark's gospel is a big deal for the West and the East. And then you're looking down in Egypt with Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. You can see the influence of what you were saying earlier in slide 1, just in the earlier uncials.
Well, when we get into patristic evidence, the evidence from church fathers, then you can see how widespread it is. But I like to not eat up too much time to keep moving.
Sure.
This is Codex E, and you can see here at the end of verse 8 is what's called a telos mark, but that's not unusual. Many manuscripts have telos marks. Every time a lection stops, there'll be a telos mark. So that doesn't mean the end of the gospel. It means the end of the lection. Up here at the top is the name of the lection from verses 9 through 20. So it was being read, it was being used when Codex E was being made. And that's not unusual at all. Here we have Codex W, which you mentioned earlier. Metzger, when he talked about the Philologion between verse 14 and verse 15, he said it is probably the work of a 2nd or 3rd century scribe who wished to soften the severe condemnation of the 11 in 1614, in which case, wherever the scribe who created the Philologion, or the interpolation between verses 14 and 15 in this manuscript, wherever he worked, that means that Mark 16, 9 through 20 was in that location. Also, there's a group of manuscripts called Family 1. And about 15 of the members of Family 1 feature a note about Mark 16, 9 through 20. And this isn't these 15 scribes spontaneously coming up with a comment to make. They're all writing basically the same thing. In one form, the note says, in some copies, the evangelist's work is completed here, and so do Eusebius Pamphilia's Canons. And if anybody wants to ask about the Canons, we can go into that. The note then says, though, in many, this also appears. Now, Bruce Metzger, in his textual commentary, he mentioned this very vaguely. He didn't say exactly how many. It's like when somebody says, oh, many manuscripts. Well, how many is that? Is it 10, 15, 1,000? It's 15. But these manuscripts, first they say this form of the note, and then after time goes by, note changes to not mention Eusebius Pamphilus canons. By the time the note is shortened, Eusebius's canons have already been expanded to include verses 9 through 20. It just says, in some of the copies, the gospel is completed here, but in many, this also appears. Now, in manuscripts 20, 215, and 300, if I can just read this, the note says, from here to the end forms no part of the text in some copies, but in the ancient ones, it all appears intact. Now, Mestre never mentioned that little detail. To continue, Irenaeus, we're going to take another look at Irenaeus later on, but Irenaeus was a bishop in Lyon, which is in France. It was Lugdunum in the 100s. But as Irenaeus is writing, and he quotes from Mark, he says in Against Heresies, and you can read Against Heresies online, he says, also towards the conclusion of his gospel, Mark says that after the Lord Jesus Christ appeared to them, he was received up into heaven and sits at the right hand of God. Well, that's obviously a quotation from Mark 16, verse 19. So Irenaeus, before the creation of Vaticanus, before the creation of Sinaiticus, earlier than any copy of Mark 16 we have, when Irenaeus is reading his copy, he quotes from Mark 16, verse 19. And we see two manuscripts which mention this statement. In manuscript 1582 and in manuscript 72, they both include this note. So Irenaeus is very important evidence. Now, he's not the only second century writer, but we'll take a closer look soon. Because Mestre also mentioned that he said, Clement of Alexandria and Origen show no knowledge of the existence of these verses. And that line comes up so much. If you're reading a commentary that says this, you're reading a parrot of Mestre, because this line gets flung out far and wide in commentaries. Now, in 1964, Mestre originally said that Eusebius also shows no knowledge of verses 9 through 20. Mestre was wrong about that. At some point, he quietly corrected himself. And so in 1992, the edition of his text of the New Testament, he replaced Eusebius's name with Ammonius. There's no acknowledgement that he made a mistake, but he does correct it. But most people, when they say that, they say, oh, well, wow, if Clement and Origen didn't quote it, surely they must not have known it. Well, but that's not really a justifiable assumption or extrapolation. What can be extrapolated from Clement and from Origen is really almost nothing. A while ago, a guy named Karl Kozart examined the text of Clement and said, how much of Mark did Clement actually use? Well, in his writing called Who is the Rich Man Who Shall Be Saved, he used quite a bit of Mark chapter 10. But outside chapter 10, he hardly used anything. Except in Mark chapter 10, Clement used no more than 8 verses of the rest of the book. In other words, he used only 1.3% of Mark chapters 1 through 9 and chapters 11 through 16 combined in his writings. So there's no real particular reason why we should expect Clement, who uses Mark so sparingly, to use verses 9 through 20. Also, a question often comes up about the vocabulary of the last 12 verses, because Mestre says, well, there's so many non-Markan words. Well, the assumption is that Mestre is making, or that he made rather, because he's dead now. The assumption that's built in there is that if it's used only once, then it's not his style. But if you compare other 12-verse sections of Mark, you can see that in Mark 7, 17 through 28, that's 12 verses, and there's 21 once used words. In chapter 12, verse 34 through 13:1, there's 19 once used words. Basically, you have to ask yourself, if being a once used word makes it non-Markan, then are Mark 7, 17 through 28, Mark 12, 34 through 51, 13:14 through 13:25, Mark 14:1 through 14:12, Mark 14:37 through 14:48, Mark 15:13 through 24, and Mark 15:37 through 61. Are those going to be considered non-Markan? Because all of them have more once used words than Mark 16:9 through 20.
That's an interesting perspective because that one's used quite a bit, because it is true. There are non-Markan terms there, and some would even say the style changed a little bit at the very end from the, and what we believe of Mark is true is that he is writing on behalf of Peter. It's actually Peter's gospel, so to speak. He's using Peter's eyewitness testimony to do so. But if what you said is true about Mark finishing or doing those last 12 verses, even with that explanation, there would be a little bit different style, I guess, because you're finishing something that's slightly different from the rest of what you've been doing all along. Would you say that explains some of the stylistic differences, is the fact of Peter's involvement versus non-involvement?
Can you ask it again? I don't think I caught the question.
So one of the arguments, in addition to the one word usages, like, well, this is only used one time here, like you're showing, because that would demonstrate a problem across the board. But so the problem that people have is not just the words, but the style. Like some of the form and style of how Mark's gospel ends is slightly different from how the narrative has gone all along, which, if we believe, and I think it's correct, that Mark's gospel is Peter's, and that Mark was writing the eye testimony witness of Peter, could it be that the last 12 verses changed a little bit stylistically because of what you gave as a hypothesis for the last 12 verses in slide 1? And is that maybe some of the difference in style, or what would change the stylistic form of narrative?
Well, yes.
Would it be because of Peter's involvement or no involvement?
I think if you look at any author, they're capable of different styles depending on who the audience is and what kind of book they intend to write. If Mark was intending to write a simple summary of resurrection appearance of Christ for the church to use at Easter, that might not be the same thing he would write when he sits down to write, this is what Peter recollected about all of Jesus' appearances. You'll see it earlier, this kind of a preview where we're talking about Peter, and we don't see a one-on-one between Jesus and Peter anywhere in verses 9 through 20.
Yeah, so you could see kind of where he withdraws himself as the author behind it, and it's Mark on his own, almost insinuated in such a way.
Well, yes, I don't think that necessarily that Peter himself may or may not have been involved, but I think it would be up to the scribe to ask that question, and one who had doubts would not automatically include it. But that's in Egypt.
It's just interesting that the Egyptian, because Mark went down to Alexandria after Peter was executed, and became one of the bishops down in the main church there in that area of Alexandria. So it's kind of odd that Mark's inclusion was not the one that was, you think it would be down in Egypt, they would be utilizing Mark's finish rather than taking it out on the basis of Petrine authority only, when he was the authority behind the apostles that went and represented the apostles' work down in Egypt. But I know there's a lot of time that matched between Mark's death and Vaticanus Sinaiticus. But it's interesting that he went down to Egypt as a bishop, and he was the one being disregarded when it came to those last verses, except for when it came to perhaps public readings.
Well, any connection between the historical career of Mark and the transmission history of the book of Mark in Egypt, that belongs to the realm of hypothesis.
Correct.
But here I want to point out simply that the 18 or so non-Markan words in Mark 16:9 through 20, and I put non-Markan in quotes there. Mark uses more than that in other 12-verse segments, and that should not be overlooked. In other words, when people read Mestra and see that, it leaves a misimpression. Now, Codex Babiensis here, because we're going to have to keep moving to get through all these. Codex Babiensis is the only manuscript in existence that has the shorter ending after verse 8 and nothing else. But it is also one of the worst manuscripts ever written, if not the worst, of the Gospel of Mark. Babiensis has an interpolation between verses 3 and 9. Between verses 3 and 4. Also, part of verse 16:8 is missing. Also, as he's writing this shorter ending, he writes it very badly. For instance, he writes from east to east instead of from east to west, and leaves out words as he goes. He doesn't write Peter, he writes child, and things like that. He's barely literate. What you see here is Codex L. Codex L is another copy with the shorter ending between 16:8 and 16 verses 9 through 20. And you need to notice the notes that are in Codex L, because the notes are a giveaway to the location of the scribe. This is an Egyptian manuscript. Here we see, if you look over here on the very far left, you see the text ends with the end of verse 8, and there's a line drawn, and then it says, some also have this appearing, and that's the shorter ending. Then it says, and some also have this after F about the guard, in other words, after the end of verse 8. And that begins verse 9 there with the Anastasis Dei there on the first page. The second page continues with more text and then closes out with the end of chapter 16, verses 9 through 20. And then the gospel concludes, and you have the beginning of a list of chapters of Luke. But let's zoom in on the notes. You can see here's a close-up of what I just described. That's the end of verse 8. Note that says, in some there's also this, then the shorter ending, then this note, and then the beginning of verse 9. Now this is all in Codex L. We also have Greek Sinaitic Lectionary 1602. Now when I say Sinaitic, that means it's Egyptian. Sinaitic was simply a dialect, a Coptic dialect there in Egypt. And when we look at its notes, they're very, very similar to what we see in Codex L. Note up here says in other copies this is not written. And this note again says the same thing that you see in Codex L, Codex 0044 or Psi, and 083. And when you look at Codex 099, which is not much more than this page, it has the text of, instead of just restarting from the end of verse 8, it kind of rewinds and puts us back in the middle of verse 8. And then it begins verse 9. So you can see the same format as L and the format that was in Codex 099. They're also used in a Sinaitic lectionary. So, in other words, the thing to see is that Codex L, Codex Psi, 083, 099, in other words, almost all of the copies in Greek that have the shorter ending before the longer ending, they're all connected to the same transmission stream as Greek Sinaitic Lectionary 1602. In other words, they're all echoing a transmission line from Egypt.
Which makes sense with the tradition we've been talking about all along in Egypt.
Yes, but we need to get an idea of an understanding of what the tradition was in Rome, where the book of Mark was actually written and where it was initially disseminated. Let's look at the patristic evidence. Now, again, there's some terrible misinformation out there in the book The Smart Guide to the Bible by H. Walker Evans and Larry Richards. They say none of the early church fathers indicate a witness of these verses for the first few centuries of Christianity. I think that Craig Evans has shared similar ridiculous claims, because when you look at the writers like Justin Martyr, in his first apology, chapter 45, he appears to use the same verbiage as verse 20. And also in chapter 50, he uses some of the same verbiage as we see in verse 14. Epistula Apostolorum does not have any direct quotations, but the framework of the narrative in Epistula Apostolorum implies the author's awareness of verses 9 to 20. Robert Stein has gone into more detail about that. Also, Tatian, around the year 170. Again, this is more than a century before the earliest manuscripts we have. In his Diatastron, he includes verses 9 to 20. And like we already saw from the previous slide, Irenaeus, around the year 180, explicitly quotes from Mark 16:19. Some other authors that use material from verses 9 to 20, and I don't mean they quote all 12 verses at once, that would be amazing, but but quoting from one verse shows that the rest was there. And here are some that are pretty early. Hippolytus, the Didascalia Apostolorum, Vincentius at the Seventh Council of Carthage, the composition De Baptismate that was made about the same time. Also, the Old Latin Capitula. Now, the Capitula are chapter summaries. They're not the same chapters as our chapters. They chopped up the books differently. The segments are not the same size. But in the Old Latin Capitula, it includes verses material or references to verses 9 to 20. Also, Heracles or Hierocles used part of Mark 16, 17 through 18 as a challenge to Christians. Now, Hierocles was not a Christian writer. He was a Roman governor in close to Asia Minor. And he's told the Christians in one of his books, you who want to become bishops, you ought to have a contest and see who can drink the poison, the passages. And so Hierocles was using that verse to kind of jibe at Christians. Also, Aphraates. Now, Aphraates is a writing in Syriac around the year 337. That's about the same time when Vaticanus was made. And in his demonstration 1, he also uses material from Mark 16 to 20. He's probably using the Diatastron. Also, Acts of Pilate is another composition from the 300s, uses Mark 16 to 20, or a piece of it, in chapter 14. Also, Marinus. Marinus is the correspondent to Eusebius of Caesarea. And as he's writing to Eusebius, because Eusebius alludes to his letters, as Eusebius is writing, he can tell that Marinus' text includes verses 9 to 20, and that's the point at which Eusebius, that's kind of his takeoff point for what he says. You don't see these mentioned very often in your textual apparatus. You probably should. But Eusebius is one of the highlights here, because he kind of zooms in on the passage. But it's important to realize everything that Eusebius says and not just get little snippets here and there. So let's zoom in and see what Eusebius says about Mark 16, 9 to 20. But not in snippets, but to look at it in detail. Eusebius, you see, a Metzger has this claim, and this has gone through commentators far and wide, where he says, Eusebius and Jerome attest that the passage was absent from almost all Greek copies of Mark known to them. Well, if all you see is snippets, and that's what a lot of the commentators have only seen because they haven't looked into it, that's all they see, that's all they're going to think. But Eusebius has a lot more to say about the passage. He presents the claim that the passage is absent from almost all copies of Mark as something that somebody could say. In other words, its framework is the thing to see. So as Eusebius responds to Marinus, he says, one who marks that pericope as spurious would say it's not found in all copies of the Gospel according to Mark. It's important to notice how Eusebius frames it. That's what somebody could say. But Eusebius does not stop there. He keeps on going. He says accurate copies in the text of the Markan account. Stephen, can you just go ahead and read this?
Yeah, sure. It says accurate copies in their text on the Markan account with the words of the young man whom the women saw and who said to them, do not be afraid. It is Jesus, the Nazarene, that you are looking for, etc. After which it adds, and when they heard this, they ran away and said nothing to anyone because they were frightened. That is where the text does end in almost all copies of the gospel according to Mark. What occasionally follows in some copies, not all, would be extraneous, most particularly if it contains something contradictory to the evidence of the other evangelists. That then would be one person's answer to reject it entirely, evading the question of superfluous. So basically, he's continuing his phrase there and says that the text does end in almost all the copies of the gospel according to Mark in his further statement.
Notice at the end, that is what one person could say. That would be one person's answer, to reject it entirely, obviating the question as superfluous. But he goes on from there. And then we have this part. Go ahead and read this part, please.
Sure. Another view from someone diffident about so this is his continued phrasing in the same sentence, right? This isn't a whole new section. Okay. All right. So all the text of the gospel, however transmitted, it is there in the twofold reading, as in many other places, and that both are to be accepted. It is not for the faithful and the devout to judge either as acceptable in preface to the other. Supposing the latter point of the view to be granted as true, the proper thing to do with the reading is to interpret its meaning. If we were to divide up the sense of the wording, we would not find it in conflict with the words in Matthew to the effect that the Savior's resurrection was late on the Sabbath, because we should read the words in Mark, having risen early in the morning, with a pause punctuating after having risen again, and making a break in the sense before the following words.
Right. So as Eusebius continues, he says, this is view A about the person who would authorize it, but view B is the one that he then proceeds to explain. That when a person is reading the Gospels, you don't see any contradiction between Matthew 28 and Mark 16 verse 9 as far as the question of when did Jesus rise? That's what Marinus is asking about. And Eusebius, as he's explaining it, he says, if we divide up the sense of the words, all you need to do is put a comma in there. And here's how he concludes. Go ahead and read this part.
Thus 2 points of time.
You see, with our faces here, that covers up part of the words to me. But you can see it all right.
Sure.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, oh, yeah. Thus 2 points of time are presented here, that of the resurrection late on the Sabbath, and that the Savior's appearance early in the morning, as written by Mark, and the words to be read as including a pause, having risen again. Then the next words are to be pronounced after a punctuation mark. Early in the morning on the first day of the week, he appeared to Mary Magdalene, from whom he had driven out 7 devils.
Right. And so, but by the time Eusebius is done, he's explaining to Marinus how the passage should be read out loud in church. And that's not how you reject a passage.
So he recognized it in the liturgies. It was something that they regularly read, and he would have been in Caesarea, but he would have received quite a bit of manuscript evidence. Like, he would have been very familiar with things out of Egypt too. He was given access to quite a bit of information, manuscripts, and history from all over the world, especially being around Caesarea and the library there. So Eusebius is looking at a big picture here. And so your argument is that Metzger and others have zoomed in on one phrase, but really Eusebius was making a bigger argument that would have included much more.
Well, yes. What he ends up telling Marinus is that although some people would atheize it, he tells Marinus how to accept the passage and why there is not a contradiction with Matthew. He also explains, as we see here, all you do is to add a pause, and then there's no problem with any contradiction.
And that's in their reading. Put a pause there at the public reading. Yes. So yeah, and that makes sense that he would say. And that's the thing. To the churches were pretty much disputing over a liturgy issue here. Like, all right, how do we read this in church, or how do we make this actually harmonize rather than sound contradictory? Because that seems to be what Eusebius is doing here. It's like, all right, we can make this harmonize with Matthew. It's pretty simple. Put a pause. He's explaining how to harmonize these two texts instead of showing that they're contradictory. And actually, in some ways, he's almost defending it, the longer ending, when you look at it from that perspective.
Yes, but if all your commentator tells you is only the snippet of Eusebius, you would never realize that unless you look at Eusebius's writing directly. That's
a
why
fair point.
Book. Let me go back to where Roger Pierce's book. There it is. This book, Eusebius of Caesarea, by Roger Pierce, Pearse. This book can be downloaded online for free. Just run a search for Eusebius of Caesarea, Gospel Problems and Solutions. Very important. And I think this is about the only way you'll ever see all the comments that Eusebius makes on this question. Otherwise, you'll just get Metzger's snippets from here and there. And the snippets give a false impression. Also, about Jerome, Jerome, as he's writing a letter to Hedibia, now this is about 100 years later after Eusebius, and at Hedibia, he addresses the same question. Now, again, my screen is blocked by the view images, so Stephen, I have to ask you again if you can read this for our guests.
Yeah, no problem. Why do the evangelists speak differently about the resurrection of our Lord and how he appeared to his apostles? Here, you first ask why Matthew says that our Lord rose on the evening of the Sabbath when the first day of the week was just beginning to shine. And St. Mark, on the contrary, said that he rose in the morning. So this is basically the same dilemma that Eusebius was dealing with. Jesus arising in the first... What's that?
It's very, very much the same because Jerome is plagiarizing. Well, we would say today he's borrowing.
Borrowing.
But keep on going.
Yeah. Jesus arising on the first day of the week of the morning appeared to Mary Magdalene, from whom he expelled 7 demons. And she, departing, told those who were his companions as they mourned and wept. And these, hearing that he was alive and that she had seen him, did not believe in him. This problem has twofold solution. Either we do not accept the testimony of Mark, because his final portion is not contained in most gospels that bear his name. Almost all the Greek codices lack it, or else we must affirm that Matthew and Mark have both told the truth, that our Lord rose in the evening of the Sabbath, and that he was seen by Mary Magdalene in the morning of the first day of the following week. So this is how the passage of St. Mark should be read. Jesus rising. Place a little pause here, then add, on the first day of the week in the morning appeared Mary Magdalene. So that, being raised according to St. Matthew, in the evening of the last day of the week, he appeared to Mary Magdalene according to St. Mark, the morning of the first day of the week, which is how John also represented the event, stating that he was seen on the morning of the next day. D.C. Parker, The Living Text of the Gospels, page 135. Jerome's work is simply a translation with some slight changes of what Eusebius has written. Well, there you go.
Yeah. When you look into the details of what Jerome says, he's simply echoing what Eusebius said. But the takeaway, though, is they're both accepting verses 9 through 20. Jerome, when he made the Vulgate, included verses 9 through 20. And when he refers to the Philologion, he says, I found this after Mark 16:14, especially in Greek codices. So why does he say, as he's writing to Hedibia, that the Greek codices, almost all of them lack it, because he's simply echoing what Eusebius has said. It's not his own direct account. In one of his letters, letter 75 to Augustine, Jerome confessed, I candidly confess that I read the writings of the fathers, and complying with universal usage, I put down in my commentaries a variety of explanations that each may adopt from the number given, the one which pleases him. So when we see Eusebius and Jerome, it's like saying, in real life, it's Eusebius and an echo of Eusebius. It's not Eusebius and Jerome, really. Jerome showed what was in his manuscripts when he translated the Vulgate.
Interesting.
Let's move on to some other patristic witnesses who used material from Mark 16:9 to 20.
Yeah, we'll have to go through these super quick, so we'll let you fly really fast.
Okay. Fortunatus, recently discovered commentary. He quotes from there. Ephraim Cyrus, as he's making a commentary on the Testron. Ambrose of Milan, Pelagius of Ratiaria. You won't see his name in a textual commentary, but he is an author working around the late 400s. Late 300s, early 400s. Apostolic Constitutions, that's around 381. Epiphanius, Augustine, he quotes from Gabs. Jerome, again, already when he's referring to the Philologion, and also when he's making the Vulgate around 382, 383, which he said, I used ancient manuscripts as he was preparing the Vulgate. And those are manuscripts that were already ancient by 383. Chrysostom, the Doctrine of Adai, Pelagius, Philostorgius, Esnick of Gob. Esnick is an Armenian. So he's quotes from Mark 16, 17 through 18, around the year 440. Prosper Aquitaine, on the other end of the Roman Empire, also uses it. Marcus Eremita is in Israel. Patrick is in Ireland. And he's not using the Vulgate text, he's using an old Latin text. But he also quotes, in his case, verses 15 and 16. Peter Chrysologus at Ravenna in Italy, and also Leo the Great. So it's not as if the claims that we don't see it a whole lot in early writers is a little bit true. The claim that we don't see this passage in early writers is absurd. I just listed almost 40. If we keep going and look at the evidence before the 700s, you can also see this group: Victor of Antioch, Victor's Palestinian Exemplar, Severus, Leontius, Eusebius, blah, blah, blah. On down to these others, all before the 700s. There's 50 writers here. All of them are considered early, before the 700. But if age is the issue, well, you have Irenaeus and Justin and Tatian and Epistula Apostolorum in the 100s. If you consider slightly later, then you have those of the time of the Roman Empire. If you have all the earlier ones, now when we have the year 700, that's already earlier than 90% of the manuscript evidence. But you can see how widespread it was. Again, just going back for a moment, Fortunatus is in upper, what's now Bulgaria. Ephraim's in Syria. Ambrose is in Milan. Pelagius, I'm sorry, I was confused with Fortunatus. Pelagius, rather, is in what's now Bulgaria. Didymus is probably in Egypt. Jerome's working out of Bethlehem. Macarius Magnes is in Asia Minor. Chrysostom's in Constantinople. The Doctrine of Adai is probably in Syria. Again, Esnick is in Armenia. Prosper Aquitaines in northeast Italy. Marcus Eremita is in Israel. And Patrick, again, is in Ireland. Peter Chrysologus is in Italy. So it's very, 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 very widespread. But also it's important to notice that the note that I referred to earlier in Family 1, That's what these writers are referring to. When Craig Evans or N.T. Wright say that many of the older manuscripts have asterisks and obeli, marking off the long or shorter ending as spurious or at least doubtful, no, that's simply not true. Craig Evans is quite wrong. And N.T. Wright, you may have heard of N.T. Wright here and there, but he also is quite wrong. But the thing to see in Family 1 is it's the same note. It's not spontaneous scribes coming up with the same words to make this note. It's the same note being perpetuated in a particular edition of the Gospel of Mark in Family 1.
Or in some cases, a lot of those are for public reading. And as we've talked about, this has been the dispute that they were obviously having in the 4th century with Eusebius and Jerome. And, there were different places of pausing and so forth. And you showed in different manuscripts, I can't remember which one you had pulled up, James, where people are saying, oh, well, look, this is where it would have ended, when actually it would have been earlier in verse 8. So I don't know how. I'm a little bit surprised Craig Evans says that, given the fact that I'm sure he looks at quite a few manuscripts.
I'm not so
now,
sure.
I don't know about. I'm not about N.T. Wright. I mean, he's Anglican, so we got to, give a little bit of freedom. If Jonathan Sheffield were here, he would be forgiving of some of the Anglican failures. But, yeah, that is interesting.
Let's keep moving on because there's so more to cover.
Yeah, I just think the problem is people repeat a lot of the same information, I guess.
For instance, when Witherington writes that Eusebius and Jerome both tell us that these verses were absent from all Greek copies known to them, which is absurd. Ron Rhodes says these verses are absent from the old Latin manuscripts. Bobiensis is the only one that has the shorter ending. Likewise, James Edwards says the old Latin version of it's Mark 16:9-20. You must be defining the old Latin version as Codex Bobiensis, because that's the only one that doesn't have verses 9-20. That's not damaged. And Bruce Mesker and Bart Ehrman said that a number of manuscripts of the Ethiopic version do not contain Mark 16:9-20. And the thing is, in the same book, Mesker retracts that claim. But somehow, when Bart Ehrman updated the book to be the 4th edition, they didn't update it to not include that claim anymore. So if you're reading Bruce Mesker and Bart Ehrman in the 4th edition, you're reading the actual facts on one page, but on page 226, that is a statement made before 1980, when Bruce Mesker actually looked into it and realized he'd been spreading misinformation all the time until 1980, when he corrected himself. Dan Wallace, in his book Perspectives on the Ending of Mark, claimed that the scribe, can you read this part again?
Sure. Scribe might simply place an asterisk or an obelisk in the margin, indicating doubt that these verses, such as a symbol, is found in at least 5 manuscripts. And then he footnotes manuscript 138, 264. Some of it's hard for me to read on my end too. 1221, 2346, 2812, listed on 407. And then he gives the whole list there, and then you provide the data.
Yes. Yeah. For manuscript 138 and 137, these are images that you can find online using, if you were to stop the video and just to copy and paste the screenshot, you could get to these manuscripts. So for these two, I can't show you the images because they're at the Vatican Library. But you can, but using these links, you can see them yourself. You'll see in manuscript 137, there's not an asterisk, there's not an obelisk. I think he meant to write obelisk, and probably autocorrect got in the way. Anyway, there's simply a red cross at Mark 69 in the low, and also in the lower margin of the last page of Mark. So in other words, it's not there to indicate any doubt. It's simply there to do what a footnote normally does. You have the the asterisk in the text, and it's linked to the footnote. It doesn't imply doubt. It just is there to show you how to get from the part of the text that is being referred to through the annotation. In manuscript 2346, it doesn't have an asterisk or an obelisk either. It simply has these a cluster of 4 dots, and that does not indicate doubt. That's simply a mark that separates 2 segments of text.
So these are claims from Wallace that these are obelisks. So he's claiming these are obelisks there at these marks.
That's the takeaway that I think anybody reading Wallace would make. Yes. Okay. But the thing to see is in 2346, it has the same mark at John 1:43. It has the same mark at John 2:12. So telos
and RK. Yeah.
Yes. Beginning of lection, end of lection. So it's there simply to show where there is a lection break. It doesn't have anything to do with conveying doubt. And Wallace's claim, really, I would invite Dan Wallace, if he has time on his blog, to retract these claims, because it's not true about 1 through 7. It's not true about 1 through 8. It's not true about 2, 3, 4, 6. And as we see this next one, here is 264. Again, there is an asterisk, but it's not textually significant. The same, you can see the same asterisk. And can you read this? Because again, my view is blocked.
Yeah, GA 264 has an asterisk in the margin at Mark 16:9, but also has an asterisk in the margin at Mark 11:12, Mark 14:12. Luke 8:2 and Luke 19:29. These were not intended to convey doubt. They signify the beginning of the chapter / sections.
That's right. So this claim that Wallace and many others have made is really unverified, because either somebody is just spot checking out, that this is simply never taking the time to actually look at the manuscripts. They're just putting a list there. They never actually see the manuscript. If they saw the manuscript and see where the other asterisks appear, they would realize these just represent where a lection starts. Likewise, in manuscript 1221, you can see those 4 dots before Luke 1:26. So it's not there to convey doubt. Hellcat. It's not there to convey doubt. It simply stands for where a lection begins and election ends. And that's all there is to it. In 1221, at the top of the page, there's the rubric for the 3rd Hierothenon. Now, the Hierothenon was a special section of lections to be read about the resurrection. They're all at the end of Matthew, at the end of Mark, at the end of Luke, at the end of John. And we see these 4 dots. And again, Stephen, can you walk us through this page too, please?
Yeah, I'll read quick because our time's ticking. In GA 1221, okay, at the top of the page, there is a rubric for the 3rd Hierothenon, along with the incipit, the 3rd reading about the resurrection, and then it gives the quote, "At the time Jesus rose from the dead early." Accompanying the text of 69, there is between the telos symbol signifying the end of the preceding lection and the arche symbol signifying the lection's beginning. Also appears, and then it shows the emblem there. It also appears GA 1221 before Mark 2:13.
Okay, up there. That's okay. You can see that it appears quite a bit in the manuscript. It has nothing to do with conveying doubt. It has everything to do with signifying the beginning of the chapters.
Yeah, because they didn't have chapter verse content back there. Yeah, they didn't have chapter verse content back there. The closest we see to that is like Codex A does some level of chapter division. So that's a good point. Go ahead.
And the last manuscript in Wallace's list was 2812, which is in Madrid. It was lost for a while, but it turned up in Madrid. And it does not have an asterisk either. It has a little mark that is supposed to be a comment, but when I see it, I think upside down to ice cream cone, tilted sideways. And so it in manuscript, in the text, you can see the abbreviation to the right hand side. The third Heliothenon, that's the EO, and then the gamma is the number 3.
Gamma. Yep.
And then you see this mark. And if you look in the manuscript a couple more pages, there you see this annotation with the corresponding mark. And that annotation does not say, we have doubts about this. It says, it's a note from the Catena, the commentary, where the commentator is writing and says, even though Eusebius, he says, basically he refers to what Eusebius claimed and says he's found in many manuscripts, especially in his Palestinian exemplar, and therefore he includes the passage here. So this is not a note to convey doubt. This is a note to convey confidence.
Like a footnote.
It's the exact opposite of what Daniel Wallace would seem to be claiming. So, in other words, I would invite anybody who thinks that they have found a manuscript that has asterisk or obeli that are textually significant regarding Mark 16:9-20, please point it out. Otherwise, please retract your claims. And with that, I think we can go on and answer any questions anybody might have.
Sure. All right. We'll take the screen share off. Let's see if I can do that.
I will make one more point. Dale Bach in the Perspectives book claimed that the earliest Byzantine lectionaries lacked the longer ending. That claim is incorrect. Dale Bach, I think, has retracted this claim to me in personal communication. But so anybody reading Dale Bach recognize Dale Bach would modify that claim. He received, by the way, an early lectionary from about the 800s, and there we see Mark 16:9-20 in its entirety. Okay, any questions?
All right. Good presentation. A lot to take in there. I've got a few here I'm going to pull up in a second. We can go ahead and stop sharing the screen. Yes. But one of the things that I noted, and I had said to you on the side before we got down to all this, I have always been a skeptic of Mark's gospel ending, not ending. I'm a skeptic either way. I've always been kind of neutral and decided. In fact, I've heard numerous guys who lean my position where we kind of just stay neutral say, I can think of two off the top of my head that said, man, I think it goes something like this. If we found a fragmented or even a completed papyri of the last 12 verses of Mark, I'm willing to change my position. I've heard that said by numerous people because we do not have much earlier manuscripts of Mark than Vaticanus Sinaiticus outside of a fragment that was recently discovered, but that's just chapter 1. But I think there's a lot of people who on Mark's long ending, if a papyri showed up tomorrow with just one verse, I think a lot of people would be willing to switch their position. On the other hand, go ahead.
If I may, I would ask that person, what if Against Heresies, book 3 showed up today? Because Irenaeus is quoting from his copy there as he's writing Against Heresies. He quotes from his copy of Mark, chapter 16, verse 19. So why would you need a new manuscript to show up when you already have in Irenaeus' writings a reference to Mark 16:19?
I think it comes down to the fact that I think the point you made at the very beginning is compelling. Two points I find compelling from your discussion. First, why is the long ending the way it is? Why is there a controversy to begin with? Where does this start? And if it comes down to, all right, Mark was writing authoritatively under the Apostle Peter, and Peter brought Mark's material to verse 8. And then we find this longer ending, which is Mark doing some sort of consummating of his gospel, bringing it to an end, bringing it to a conclusion. I think that would explain quite a bit of the controversy. So where's the origin of the controversy? The question that has to be asked, I think, is if that's true, are the last 12 verses hypothetically approved by Peter later? Like, or do we take similar to Tregellis's position? Or so at the end of the day, the apostolic churches used the last 12 verses of Mark. That's undeniable. But Peter's involvement in it would be where some people would lean more with the Puritan form of the Egyptian churches, who were like, all right, but there wasn't Petrine authority behind it. So is it become, I think Peter Gurry's recent interview I heard with him and Elijah, I think Gurry changed his position a little bit to it's more of like an apocryphal thing on the last 12 verses because of that authoritative issue.
Well,
and you know, you're friends with Gurry. We all
how can a person even think about calling it apocryphal when it's in 99.8% of the manuscripts as well as the Vulgate?
So at some point, would you say that the apostolic leaders of those churches accepted Mark's conclusion? Like they accepted it as accurate, because that seems to be what the contention was at some point, is this is accurate. There's no contradiction. That was Eusebius' statement. So Jerome's repeating Eusebius' statement. At some point there's a contention of, all right, what do we do with accuracy? Well, put a pause here, or it actually harmonizes. If you look at it from John's view, they did everything they could to harmonize this passage to show there's no inaccuracy here. So at the end of the day, the apostolic churches used it. So there must be some level of apostolic approval. Would you agree with that?
Well, every place except Egypt, you see the longer ending. You see Mark 16:9-20 being used everywhere except Egypt. So the issue of the controversy wasn't in Rome, where the book was first written and where it was first transmitted. The controversy was there in Egypt.
So does it go to, at that point, when it comes to Egypt, did, as you pointed out in Vaticanus particularly, do they accept the writing there? They know it exists, but they tried to maintain this Petrine authority, and they distribute it for public reading purposes without the long ending. Would you say it was more about the reading and church issue as much than it was personal knowledge and usage of it? Would you say, I guess, let me stop. Is it more about the liturgy? Is it more about public reading than anything in Egypt?
I don't think the scribes in Egypt the liturgy was the main concern. I think the scribes in the 2nd century were concerned of shall we perpetuate what we consider the original through our exemplar, or do we just exercise our discernment to make a distinction between what we can see in our exemplar and what is secondary? I don't think it's phrased that way. But I think when Mark 16:9-20 came to Egypt, the scribes there recognized this is not part of Mark, the same narrative that we had earlier in Mark. That this was another that this came from was connected to a composition that was read for Easter time.
So where does that fit? Where does that fit in with Tregellis's view of the ending of Mark? Because Tregellis held a similar view, did he not?
I'd have to look up his commentary to see what his view was. But I think that the scribes were willing, just like we saw in Sinaiticus and John, they were willing to delete anything that did not look like it was part of the main source. In the case of Mark, they saw the main source as Peter. The real question, though, is, was it there or was it not there? Did just like Bergen asked more than 100 years ago, the question is not, did Mark write this? The question is not, the question that matters is, was it initially there or was it initially absent? I would argue that when that it was originally there, but the scribes in Egypt recognized that it was, even though it's there in their copy, they're aware that, or they think they're aware that it's not petrifying. It may be Markan, but Mark's just a secretary. Peter's supposed to be the source, and so
Right.
on those grounds they excise verses 9 to 20. Everywhere else, it's there in the text. It's in the Peshitta and the versions and far and wide. And we could go a little bit more into the Armenian version, but I think you said something about being late on time, so maybe other questions would come.
Yeah, and that we've answered a bunch of them as we've gone too, so that's the good news. A lot of audience questions that came in to me, I asked them as we were in them. That way we wouldn't forget. A comment came in kind of weird. His name's Alpha Omega, but it's not James White. It says the odds are of the miracle. I guess he's talking about the miracle of the long ending of Mark 16. He says, finally, someone who's looking into the miracle of Mark 16. He says, the odds of the miracle is so unlikely. It would mean God would have to base the Greek alphabet off of the long ending of Mark. Not exactly sure what he means by that. Well, what miracle? Not dying from poison? I don't know what he's saying there. Somebody said Craig Evans also subscribes to the Gospels as being Greco-Roman bias or bios. At Explain International, off topic, perhaps does James think the Gospels were Greco-Romans? Bios thinks. That is off topic. I guess it's because you brought up Craig Evans of some sort. But anyway, we answered these three here, and I got two in. Again, some of the questions I asked, people were sending me on the side too. So I've got some of these in there. I just want to make sure I didn't miss any as I'm scrolling through my personal messages and from YouTube. And it says Alpha. Yeah, so it's not Dr. White. Somebody thinks Alpha. It's not Dr. White. Trust me. It's I don't know. It's Alpha Omega, but it's not Dr. White Alpha Omega. So yeah, there's different. I think I've got everything in there, and so I guess to conclude the program, James, I think you make a good argument, and it's one that I've been contemplating about myself. And you know this. We've had disagreements in the past on the story of woman caught in adultery. There's without a doubt that the long ending of Mark has far more evidence and early citations and so forth. To me, they're almost not even comparable when you weigh the evidence. And again, we differ on the other, but the long ending of Mark has a strong case. And I think that's why most people, even Wallace, would admit the evidence is much higher for the long ending of Mark. So the reality is we have to do something with some of these things. And I think the struggle, I don't like the idea of excluding the long ending out of translations. I don't like the idea. I don't mind doing what some of these manuscripts did. And that is they did leave footnotes. We just looked at a few of them. They left commentary to Eusebius. They left record of some sort of footnote idea. I don't mind footnoting it.
Well, yes. If I may, the Family One manuscripts, that's really echoes of the same note. It's important, though, if you're going to include the first note, to include the second note that mentions that Irenaeus, who lived close to the apostles, that is around the year 180, he quoted from Mark 16:19. So many commentators have spread misinformation that it's going to take years to fix these mistakes.
Yeah, and I think the problem is that a lot of the translations that have footnotes don't include patristics. It's particularly general statements, and I do not like this. The best manuscripts.
Yeah. If the footnotes were honest and detailed and actually mentioned that 4 patristic sources in the 100s used Mark 16:9-20, and 99% of the manuscripts have Mark 16:9-20, and it's in the Vulgate and numerous other early versions, like the Gothic, which we didn't even cover. if the footnotes were candid, there would really be no question in the mind of the public about whether it should be there or not. The church has always used this text, except for in Egypt, and I think that's a special case because that's where the scribes insisted on having a connection to the source, which they did not consider the source to be Mark, they considered the source to be Peter.
And would you agree with that hypothesis at the end of the day? About that? About the Egyptian perspective?
The Mark source was Peter, but to the scribes, well, there was an autograph, and the text in the autograph was the thing to be the decisive factor of whether the verses were there or not. And from the beginning of the transmission, these verses were there.
Yeah, and see, and to be honest with you, for a guy myself, I'm more of a critical text position person. This is where I struggle with the long ending of Mark the most from the critical text perspective, is we weigh the evidence, right? I've heard critical text people accept readings from Mark's gospel just on Codex D. Like Jesus did he heal the man out of anger? I've heard Ehrman, I've heard Wallace say that, well, which one explains the rising of the other readings? And so which one's the harder reading? So they'll land with Codex D, which no other manuscript does, right, on Jesus healing him out of anger.
That, I think, is a weakness in that approach. I think the newer edition of the NIV, it goes with that same reading, and that's a mistake. I think that maybe in the next edition they'll bring themselves up to speed and to look at Codex D and its tendency toward retro translation a little more carefully. But that's getting away from the topic at hand.
Well, it is, but the point I was bringing it up is an entire textual decision would be based on Codex D alone, because we're weighing it, we're examining it, but Codex D also has the long ending. So to me, I look for consistency in certain things. Like the more I did my doctoral work, for example, when I did my dissertation on Codex H, which contained a lot of the early second century, mid second century, first, second Clement, Epistle of Barnabas, Ignatius's letters, the Didache, the only copy of the Didache we have. You start looking at things and it's like, whoa, Didache, and I would place the Didache right at the end of the first century into the second, and it's quoting passages that are not in Aleph and B, for example. And so you start earlier than just the Greek manuscript tradition. And so when you get to the long ending of Mark and you start, it's not just counting and weighing. Aleph and B have a heavy weight because of their year and their background. But what you pointed out to me about B, I think is huge. Looking at the examination of the second scribe who came in, doing the Luke gospel section there, particularly to go correct that first section, I think is a huge point that isn't talked about, James. I've never heard that explanation.
Yes. In the UBS Greek New Testament and in Nestle Allen, the cancel sheet is not noted. There's no notice to say these verses after Mark 14:54 are on a replacement sheet. There's nothing to indicate that, and there probably should be.
Well, my thing is if the cancel sheet is true and it insinuates to the fact that the scribe was not malicious, like as some TR advocates, King James only advocates, will say that the scribes in Egypt, because their perspective is, well, Egypt is evil, Egypt is corrupt, and so if the scribe was just
bear in mind, sorry to cut you off, but if Nag Hammadi was not too far from some of the Pacomian monasteries. They were in Lower Egypt, so they're not at a great distance. If you compare some elements of the Psalms and Sinaiticus, they have some overlap with the Pistis Sophia. But to get into that would be kind of getting into the tall grass.
Yeah. Yeah. And I want to stay on point with Mark for sure, because we can get into distracted conversations. I'm just going back to the fact that if B is as you described today, and we look at it from a new set of eyes with the perspective of the background of the history of what did the churches understand when they had the long ending of Mark? What did a scribe in Egypt understand when they had the long ending of Mark, especially in Egypt, because Mark went to Egypt? What did they know about the long ending? So if we concede some of these points here, to me, I think the long ending has a great argument. I do. I really do. At the end of the day, I have never been able to do a debate or a discussion where I stand against the long ending over and over. I've turned down debates on the long ending because I don't feel like I could defend the critical text position enough on it. But the more and more, and I told you this the other day, the more and more I study the long ending of Mark, the more and more it's hard for me to turn it away. I will concede to the fact that I like the argument that Peter's material ran out in verse 8. I think that answers a lot of questions for me personally. It's like, okay, so why the change of style? You mentioned the word counts, and you mentioned the unique, like, well, there's one time here and one time here, but you pointed out other places where.
Yes, there's other things to consider. For instance, Mary Magdalene is kind of reintroduced there in verse 9, and also and also in verse 8, she has companions with her on the scene. And in verse 9, it's just her. It's like, poof, they're gone from the stage. So the style is not the question. The question is, was it there or was it absent? And I would argue that it was there because we see it in so many witnesses, and they're very early witnesses. Irenaeus, Justin, the Diatessaron, that those are all earlier than our earliest manuscript.
And that's interesting. I actually wrote that one down about Mary Magdalene. It seems like, hey, we got a group of girls. Now we've got one. But I think it was in the discussion between, was it Eusebius that mentioned the fact that it was consistent with, or was it Jerome that mentioned the consistency there with John? Because all John does is focus on Mary Magdalene alone out of all the women. All he mentions the others, but it focuses on the narrative. And that could be the fact that, he was not just a friend of Peter. Mark would have known other apostolic witnesses, and maybe he ran into Mary Magdalene on the way and got her perspective in his closing. There could have been that part of it too. We don't know. It's speculation, but I'm at the point where I see a good and a better argument for the long ending as I grow in my study of it too. And again, I'm critical text. I mean, if somebody wants to put me in a camp, I'm a critical text person. But I think if we consider the evidence of Mark, I think it's not worth arguing against, to be honest with you, in my opinion. I'm at the point where I've never wanted to argue against it, but the more and more I study it, the more I don't want to argue against it, because it seems too early, too many witnesses, and too much reasoning to just dismiss it.
Well, also, if you look at the church in Egypt, the only place where we see Mark 16, 9-20 not being accepted, I know Armenia is another story, but if you look at Egypt, of how scribes dealt with the text, as more manuscripts from other places invaded Egypt, we see the longer ending and the shorter ending side by side. I think that somebody in Egypt, when they had just up to verse 18, at some point earlier on, they couldn't stand to have it just end at verse 8. And so somebody made the shorter ending. That's excuse me. And that's what we see in Codex L and about eight Greek witnesses. Quite a bit more in Coptic and quite a bit more in Ethiopic. But they're all echoing a situation where somebody made up the short ending to add on. But after the short ending was made, the usual verses 9 through 20 was introduced, and in the Egyptian transmission stream, that's what won out. That's why we only have Vaticanus and Sinaiticus as the only witnesses to ending at verse 8. Witnesses that earlier, such as Irenaeus and Justin and Tatian, include verses 9 to 20. They don't express any doubt about them. The manuscripts that include asterisk and abeli don't exist in real life. The only manuscripts that remain is Family 1, which have a note there, but go ahead and include verses 9 to 20.
Well, there's a comment that came in from Nick Sayers. He said, I think James's concept where the last 12 verses were added later is not valid. It is his speculation only.
I would emphasize to Nick Sayers, Nick, I have never said that the verses 9 through 8 were added later, unless you're saying something like, what's the difference between that and saying that, well, they were added later because they were added after verse 8 was written? Obviously, they would have to be consecutive.
I think he's referring to the discussion we've had about Petrine authority up to verse 8 into Mark concluding his own, if you want to call it ending. Maybe that's what he's talking about. I don't think he's talking about like some random person did it. I think he's probably talking about the theory that Peter ended his authority in verse 8 and Mark finished his own gospel.
Well, no, that's not quite the hypothesis. The hypothesis that I've made, that I've been presenting, is that Mark was interrupted permanently as he was writing verse 8. He had more to write, but he didn't write it. That wasn't his intention. But those to whom the Gospel of Mark was entrusted recognized that's not where he wanted to stop. He wanted it to be more. And so instead of writing something new, they added material to what Mark had written from another Markan composition. And they don't intersect smoothly in the narrative. That's why Mary is reintroduced, the day is reintroduced, and her two companions are no longer on the scene. But that was considered a better option than simply starting something fresh. Because they don't start something fresh, the reason why they don't start something fresh is because they already have this other material from Mark or from the Markan community, which they include. When the Gospel of Mark is first published, when it's first transmitted, when copies begin to be made, verses 9 through 20 are there. So Nick Sayers, there is no later, because that's the first point at which the Gospel of Mark is transmitted.
Well, he responded to you. He said, nice story after you gave your explanation. He said, but there is no evidence for that.
Well, I would argue, though, that the internal evidence shouldn't be minimized. Nick would have to come up with some explanation for why is Mary reintroduced? Why are her companions no longer on the scene? Why is there no longer a mention of Galilee specifically? Why do we have no one-on-one between Jesus and Peter? These would all be things that we would expect, but we don't see them materialize after verse 8.
Yeah, and I think that's been one of the biggest issues that critical text components have had on this end of it, is there is absolutely an interruption between verse 8 and 9. There is maybe Nick or others in his wave of thinking want to pretend it's smooth, but I think anybody reading it especially in its original form, there is an interruption. There is a narrative change. There is a directional change and a reintroduction to characters, but in a different scene. So I'm with you on that, but I think what you're making an argument for is you can still have the interruption and have an early testimony of Mark earlier than Vaticanus Sinaiticus, but also recognizing that the scribes of those documents would have known exactly what you're talking about.
Well, hold on. First, we know, or we can make a deduction, because we're not insane, that Irenaeus has Mark 16:19 in his own copy when he's writing against heresies in the year 180. Yes. And that's more than a century before Vaticanus is made. So there's no reason to even bring Vaticanus and Sinaiticus into the discussion about when it comes along, because it's already there in 180.
Right.
We see it already there in 160 with Justin. And we see
and their scribes would have known
in 150 with Epistula Apostolorum. Right?
Yeah. But the scribes of Vaticanus Sinaiticus would have been familiar with why and why they stopped in verse 8, intentionally stopped in verse 8, especially in Sinaiticus. So you've already demonstrated all those things. There's an explanation. At the end of the day, there's an explanation to it. But well, we're gonna have to leave it there, my friend. We're gonna have to call it a night with the information. There's a lot there for the audience to chew on. More statements. Now they're all arguing amongst themselves. We'll let them do that. Yeah. But we'll let them go amongst themselves in the audience. But thank you for.
If I may just clarify this one point, and that is, like Bergen said years and years ago, the question is, was it not? The question is not the question that matters. The key question is not who added it. The question is, was it there in the text at the moment when the text of Mark, the Gospel of Mark, began to be disseminated? That's what defines original.
Yeah, and I think with that, we could add that it's not even necessarily about who added or did there and you repeated this, you don't think the scribes in Egypt were evil and malicious and intentionally trying to distort and take it out because they hated it either. There was more going on than what was just said there.
Yes, I think that's the same kind of thing happened in Sinaiticus at the end of John. But we don't take out the last verse of John just because the case can be made internally that this is secondary. That somebody is saying we instead of I. That's not that. Although through an Alexander scribe, that might justify taking it out. But the church that distributes the manuscripts says no, we should keep it in. And I would agree with that.
I got a question that came in for me here at the end. I want to question for Boyce. If Aleph and B are both incorrect on such a significant point as the last 12 verses of Mark, what is their credibility when this is coupled with their many singulars? What then? Again, I don't understand the point of the question, because we're not saying that these are credible issues or incorrect. And I haven't heard at any point where you said that the scribes were doing anything incorrect, as much as they were following, specifically you said about B, following the protocol of its purpose. I don't think they're incorrect. I don't think that devalues Aleph and B. See, this is where the Byzantine priority people come swinging in. They're like, oh, they hear Stephen say, oh, Stephen's conceding the fact that the long ending of Mark might be legit against Aleph and B, so Aleph and B can't be trusted for anything. That's not what I'm saying at all. I think Aleph and B are two of our most important manuscripts and should be consulted on a regular basis. Now, you and I may differ on that. And his point that he just made is you obviously follow them elsewhere. Yeah, but the Aleph and B are not always in a position like you see with the long ending of Mark. This is a very rare occasion in a long section like that, where Aleph and B pretty much stand alone with a medieval manuscript. Because when you go to the woman caught in adultery, it's not just Aleph and B anymore. So I think that's an unfair assumption to be made in the comments there by Matthew, because I don't think the credibility of Aleph and B is hinging on the long ending of Mark, especially if we understand circumstantially what James has presented through this whole thing, particularly about the scribes in Egypt and their protocol for transmission. So I don't think this at all belittles or lowers the credibility of those two manuscripts. You may not like Aleph and B in its readings against Byzantine priority. And if you're in the comments, you have every right to have a position that's different from mine. James and I certainly don't agree on certain positions of readings, but James, just throw this into you. Do you think the credibility of Aleph and B are diminished on this?
Just for this particular point, no.
No, just as a whole, as the manuscript, like the manuscript as a whole.
Well, Sinaiticus, if you look at its readings in detail, I'd say Matthew 27:49 would be much more of an issue as far as the reliability of the text. When in Matthew, in both these manuscripts, as well as most other of the early representatives of the Alexandrian text, they tend to make a mistake in Matthew that makes Matthew contradict John. And that makes the Alexandrian text, if you follow the Alexandrian text, then you're following an errant text. Some of the other readings in the Byzantine text may be lectionary influence. They may be clarifications that are not original, but it is exceptional to see an actual error being in the text of two manuscripts like this.
Yeah, and just to be clear, 49. And just to be clear, Matthew's saying it was a question, not an assumption. The question, again, you have to consider the fact that Aleph and B don't even agree with each other on many points. Like, it's not like they're just brother and sister that always agree with each other.
Yes.
They differ quite a bit.
In Sinaiticus, at Matthew 13:35, it says that Isaiah is the author of Psalm 72. That's obviously an error. And so again, if you're following that the text of Codex L, then you're using an errant text, and that was proposed by Hort. Hort, in his notes on select readings, argued for accepting the reading of Sinaiticus in Matthew 13:35. That's something to consider.
And there's no doubt that, and that's why these manuscripts had correctors. There's errors all in these manuscripts. There's errors in every manuscript. And that's, to me, that's the point. That's why we're weighing the manuscripts when we look at them. Again,
I would make the distinction between a scribal error, where a scribe might spell the word immediately a different way, and an actual statement in the text that is erroneous.
Well, yeah, I concede and agree on that. The point I'm making is that these scribes, a lot of them get accused of doing malicious things when a lot of times they're just transmitting something that's in front of them, or mistaking something that was in front of them in transmission, which happened quite frequently too. That's why we don't just look at one single manuscript. And I don't believe that when we're looking at
that's what I proposed happened to Mark 16, verse 9 to 20. A copyist examined the text in the 2nd century, considered what is the source of this, and because his answer, whether his answer was right or wrong, but because of that answer, he extrapolated that verses 9 through 20 should be considered secondary, and either one step or two steps, it was excised. But initially, it was there. And because it was initially there, it should be proclaimed and accepted as scripture and part of the word of God.
Nick jumped in and said B and Aleph should be rejected, like Bize is rejected. And I could not disagree more. I think that they should be accepted in the sense of they are old readings. I think all manuscripts should be examined, whether you like them or not. Whether you go with the reading or not, they should be examined. They are historically passed down documents that have survived antiquity that represent a reading of the time. But I will say this is the biggest mistake that people make, is we make an entire reading on one single thing. Like we already talked about the example in Codex Bize on Jesus healing somebody out of anger. We're going to reject all the other evidence, but we're going to accept that one because it's unique reading. I don't buy that. So I do agree that there's some people in the critical text positions that run with things just on the basis of one single manuscript or two single manuscripts. But we have not just manuscripts. And the more that I have done research in the patristics, I did my dissertation in the patristics, You're looking at all of these ancient texts in the 2nd century. You're looking how they used the New Testament. It opens your eyes to more than just the Greek New Testament. It takes you into Latin. It takes you into the Ethiopic. It takes you into Coptic. It takes you into Armenian. It takes you into Georgian. It takes you into all these other languages. And you see how the world used the New Testament. Like you said, how did Irenaeus quote it? How did Justin Martyr quote it? Now you have a broad spectrum. You're not just looking at a Greek transmission in one location. You're looking at a global transmission in addition to translation transmissions, ancient translations. And then you're looking at the patristics, like trying to explain why these things happen, why there were transmission differences, why there were messages left in margins. To me, we're looking at a big picture. Now, at the end of the day, there's differences that everybody will look at the same evidence and walk away differently. But I think that the problem is, I don't like the attitude, James, where we have a manuscript that somebody may believe is an inferior one, where we treat it as, let's just throw it out. Let's just throw it out. We don't need it. Let's reject it. I think that all manuscripts that survived.
If I may, one thing that people need to realize is the base text of the ESV, the base text of the NASB, and of the NIV, and of the CSB. If you look into the details, most of the editors in the preface of those Bibles will say that the New Testament base text was, the starting point was the addition of Westcott and Hort. Mm-hmm. And Westcott and Hort, one of their foundational points was, when Sinaiticus and Vaticanus agree, they outweigh everything else with very few exceptions. So Westcott and Hort's text is basically where you have its primary basis is the agreements of Codex B and Codex Aleph. You can look at Westcott and Hort, and he says that out loud. Well, obviously the book doesn't speak out loud, but he says that explicitly in his introduction. That's the starting point of the revised text. And the modern text today is only differs from Westcott and Hort's product in about 700 places. A while back, I made a comparison of Westcott and Hort compared to the Nestle-Aland text, and they're very, very similar. All the papyri discovered haven't really made that much difference, unfortunately.
Yeah, and again, that's because a lot of the earlier manuscripts, and would agree on some of those readings that are in there, but they did update, as you said. I think it was about 600 or 700, as you said, where there were changes, and some of that's due to papyri examinations as well, because now the papyri come in and they don't always agree with Aleph and B either. So now you have a unique position there. But all that to say, we got to wrap it up. There was more comments, but they can keep chatting.
We won't have time to get into other tangential topics, important though they might be.
Yeah, but important as they might be. Thank you, James, for coming on and presenting Mark 16 to my audience. And again, I think it's something that we should consider. I appreciate your time, your attitude towards this, and even though we had a hour late start because of some technological issues, we made it. We got through it. Materials out there for everybody to watch. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of the special edition of Facts. We're going to get back into some more of the other subjects, but this was a kind of an interruption episode meant for the audience to listen to consider as well. Thank you for tuning in. We'll see you on the next episode. Grace and peace to you.
Likewise. Bye, everybody.